Hello everyone, thanks for waiting and welcome to this week's roundtable discussion. If you're a regular attendee of one of these roundtables, you might think Rob's voice has got a little bit higher and his hair a little longer. And that's because Rob's not hosting this week, I am. I'm Eva Cahill, the editorial assistant here at Oceanographic, and I'll be chairing this week's roundtable discussion. So far, these panels have covered a wide range of topics, from Britain's sewage problems to changes in the AMOC current and conservation wins off the shores of Sussex. And these are all available to watch back on our Spotify channel and on demand on our site. But in today's roundtable, we're delving into the botched €1.5 million rescue attempt of Timmy the whale. The saga of Timmy the whale began in early March, when it was spotted off in the Baltic Sea near Wismar, entangled in fishing gear. After weeks of struggling, the whale beached itself near Timmendorfer Strand, and the whale's plight quickly became a national obsession in Germany and an international media sensation. Entanglement is the leading cause of death for large whales, and Timmy was no exception. Beached without the buoyancy of the ocean open, the whale's 12-ton weight began crushing its organs, and while the low salinity Baltic water left Timmy's skin cracked and yellow. The rescue efforts which ensued were a chaotic mix of experimental tactics. The German Federal Coastal Guard attempted to use their speedboats to create wakes to lift Timmy, but this only pushed it closer to shore. A suction dredge failed to move the dense Baltic sand, and when a special excavator was brought in to dig a trench, its metal bucket is thought to have accidentally pierced Timmy's skin. And as Timmy's condition worsened, marine experts from the German Oceanographic Museum and the International Whaling Commission warned that further intervention amounted to torture. They recommended palliative care and keeping the whale wet and calm until it died peacefully. Consequently, the German Minister for Agriculture, Environment and Consumer Protection, Till Backhaus, announced his decision to let the whale die peacefully. But the public had collectively become attached to Timmy. There were social media campaigns, Timmy the Whale songs, and believe it or not, people getting tatted in his honour. So, following the weight of huge public outcry, the government soon reversed its course, and private funding poured in, led by Media Market co-founder Walter Guntz, and the mission was handed to a rescue team that included a Peruvian whale whisperer and a far-right influencer. Timmy was loaded into a water-filled transport barge for a journey towards the North Sea. And experts at the time warned the metal walls would reflect the whale's sonar, causing extreme distress. Drone footage later confirmed that Timmy was thrashing against the sides of the barge. The plan was to release the whale in open water, but instead he was dropped 70 kilometres north of Skagen, Denmark, directly into a busy shipping lane. And then just last weekend, a whale washed up on the shores of Denmark, and it was confirmed to be dead, and it was also confirmed to be Timmy. The story raises questions about how so much public support rallied behind Timmy while hundreds of whales die from entanglement every year. It asks why, at a time when public funding for conservation and wildlife is declining, €1.5 million was found to save an animal that experts believed needed palliative care. And more broadly, it highlights how we as humans relate to the natural world at a moment when, in the face of a growing climate crisis, that relationship is more important than ever. So, to peel back the layers of this news story, we have a really interesting mix of panellists on today's roundtable. Firstly, we have Dr. Finn Andreas Weiberg, who is head of the WWF Baltic Sea Office, based in Stralsund, Germany, where he works on protecting one of the world's most environmentally precious seas, campaigning issues from emergency response to shipping safety and marine conservation. So, welcome to the stage, Dr. Finn Andreas. Perfect. Second up, we have Dr. Jared Piazza, who is a senior lecturer in social psychology at Lancaster University, where his research focuses on moral decision-making, particularly how and why we extend moral concern to animals, the psychology behind what we eat, and the emotions that drive our ethical judgments. So if you'd like to come on stage too. Lovely. And finally, we have Dr. Matthew Adams, who's principal lecturer in psychology at the University of Brighton. His research lies at the intersection of psychology and the natural world, exploring our relationships with animals and how we make sense of ecological crises and what our connection to nature means for our mental health and well-being. Thanks so much for joining us today. I'm really excited to dig into this topic with you guys. There we are. And as always, if anyone in the chat wants to submit any burning questions for our experts to answer, please feel free. But coming to you first, Finn, could you give us a sense of the wider threats facing marine life in the Baltic Sea? How big of an invisible problem is the entanglement crisis? And what are the threats that these animals are facing?
Thank you for having me. It's a little bit kind of really the problem of an ocean we have here that is very, very busy, and it's kind of surrounded by the richest European countries, and it's also not only the ecosystem, but it's kind of used by fisheries, but it's also used by shipping lines. It's a military zone, and on top of this, we have the offshore wind energy, all demands of kind of supplies in the Baltic Sea. And each of this has its kind of footprints in it. And as all these players are active in this ecosystem, you can imagine that it's kind of under threat also from land, as we have the farmers and municipalities spilling all the nutrients into the Baltic Sea. And where the whale came in, it's kind of a bottleneck. And here we have a limited water exchange, and this is why we have this kind of problems that once it's in the Baltic Sea, theoretically, the water exchanges by about 30 years. So whatever we drop there will take a longer time to get actually flushed out into the North Sea. So here we have really a multi-aspectual kind of threat to the Baltic Sea, which we need to address. And we need to have this kind of ocean literacy around the Baltic Sea on all levels.
Mm-hmm. And I guess if there's that like myriad of threats in the Baltic Sea, maybe we can come to you, Jared. Why has one animal, Timmy, managed to garner so much public support when there's so many other systemic threats facing our environment? Like Iceland just kind of announced they were on the precipice of beginning whaling again. We have huge problems to do with our ocean. So why have we managed to gather behind one individual?
Yeah, so can you hear me? I'm not muted, am I? Okay. Yeah, well, first, thanks for having me on. Yeah, hopefully I can provide some of the insights into the public response. I mean, I think there's a number of factors. First is how our attention when it comes to, individuals in need, whether that's animals, humans or animals. The psychology here is very much if, individuals who are in front of us in need, and we see that they are in need, that's what grabs our attention. And that's what our emotions respond to, our moral emotions, our empathy. Less so that when you have these more, complex problems that involve a myriad of individuals, that's less likely to, elicit our moral response, our emotional, our moral emotions, our sympathies, and so on. But if we see one individual there in front of us, and there's something, maybe we also feel that there's more that we can do for that individual, where if it's, millions of lives, if you're thinking the level of conservation, we're usually thinking about populations, and they're often very complex in terms of multiple systems, where individuals are embedded in these very complex systems. What can I do to help that? It's a wicked problem. It's very complex. That can lead to compassion collapse because people think, well, what can I do? My help is maybe a drop in the bucket. But if there's an individual in front of you that's in need of your help, maybe there's something you can do. It gets your attention. And people, there was images of Timmy, and it was shared on social media, and it was spread, and that was very captivating, and that was able to elicit those emotions. In psychology, we call this the victim identifiability effect, that individuals in need expressing that need in front of us, that's what we respond to much more than hearing, 3 million individuals are in need of our help. those numbers don't activate our moral emotions in the same way. They're sort of morally inert, those numbers. So I think that, so there's several things going on, but primarily it's about how our moral emotions get activated. And this story, and this focus on one individual whale really captured our imagination. The narrative, the story was shared, and people were able to kind of grab onto that, and it captured, got our attention, got our emotions going.
Yeah. And I guess it really did captivate the public's attention and led to a kind of like hyper empathy and intense relationship with Timmy the whale. And I was wondering, if we come to you, Matthew, what can that tell us about us as a society's mindset and relationship to nature, and how we're relating to the ecological and climate crisis facing our planet at the moment?
Yeah, thanks for having me too. It's nice to build on these first two contributions and think about the kind of social and cultural dimension a bit more, maybe. But I would agree, we respond to similarity, and that kind of proximity and naming is one way of doing that. So it closes the gap. I mean, it's what we do with companion animals in terms of empathy, isn't it? So it can be positive and it can facilitate care. But the question here, I suppose, isn't why people cared about Timmy. It's on a societal level anyway. It's what that care kind of couldn't reach. And I suppose on a social level, you could argue that it's a kind of displacement of ecological grief. The 1.5 million euros, the tattoos, the things you mentioned, the songs, they're not really about one whale. You could argue they're about a horror or a terror that we don't really have a container for. Mm-hmm. This is ecological grief displacement, the things that Finn talked about on one level, those kind of interrelating things, vast, but also structureless in many ways, dread of what we sense is happening to the living world, right? And we pour it into one vessel when we can see and connect to it. And in this case, it was Timmy. It becomes a grief object in kind of psychoanalytic terms broadly for something much larger than Timmy. So it's not really an individual pathology, as you're kind of hinting at with this, on this societal level. It's a cultural one. And we could argue it's about what happens when a culture has no shared ritual or rituals or language to collectively form mourning for ecological loss at this scale, or the complexities at this scale. So it's a management of that in a way, this displacement, we could argue.
Mm-hmm. So it's more symptomatic of a wider cultural inability to express the kind of grief we have at the climate crisis as it's evolving.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways it could represent what's been called an Anthropocene story, which is the kind of complexity that Finn mentioned. These kinds of stories are starting to highlight multiple independent relationships and connections between animals, technology, landscapes, and so on. But those interrelations actually get lost and backgrounded when we focus on individuals. That's one of the downsides, I think, whether it's about rescue or blaming them later, part of the same process, arguably, that individualizing of the crisis. So as Jared says, it's kind of a natural or instinctive thing to do, but it quietly protects us from the literacy or the systemic account that Finn's talking about as being important. We can love Timmy and eating fish caught in the gear that kills whales. You can donate to the fund, but not ask about the thing you mentioned at the end of the story about the kind of the German North Sea not really being, protections not being enforced. They kind of, that individualization obscures those kinds of narratives and problems in a way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really interesting. And Finn, to come to you, you work in conservation, and within a sort of, I've seen online experts are saying that, this sector is increasingly finding itself under smaller budgets. But this one rescue effort managed to raise 1.5 million euros almost overnight, kind of working off social media publicity and far right-wing influencers becoming involved. And I wanted to get your sense as someone who is in Germany and who works in the sector, what your thoughts were on the way this money, how this money was raised, and what do you make of this amount of money being managed to be raised overnight for one whale?
Yeah, it's interesting, and also listening to Jared and Matthew about the motivation probably to start the donation. In the first place, if you want to have a positive look at it, you can still see that in the society you have this kind of really neat and positive will to get, you know, the helplessness you kind of express in donating to rescue this stranded whale. On the other side, I had the feeling that there was this pressuring will that there need to be some action, and for on the scientific point of view, it was kind of pretty clear from the beginning that the whale is kind of weak. It is injured, possibly sick, and so the advice clearly from international but also national authorities were keep it, keeps the pain to the minimum, water it, but leave it alone, keep it kind of, distant to all kind of activities. But this was kind of the opposite that was expressed from the other kind of actors, because they want to have actions. And this is, I had the feeling that this was overwhelming, and the politicians, especially the minister Backhaus, he decided then to kind of leave science aside and then arguing in terms of rescuing one individual for the sake of this individual, because this whale wants to be alive. And I also hope that in this kind of context, this kind of attitude of helping will be mirrored to an ecosystem. But then I have kind of limited kind of feelings what Jared and Matthew said is kind of really expressing and leading to such a donation. But obviously also your question was aiming for what could have been done with 1.5 million euros. I mean, this was not really transparent where the money came from and what was a community effort, or if it was just single donations pressuring also for the activity. But obviously for this 1.5 million, I mean, you could kind of restore seagrass, but you could also improve gill nets. If you don't ban them, you could kind of, do more in terms of pingers to kind of keep the harbor porpoise, the native whales away from the nets. You could do much more practical work in nature with this 1.5 million, and hopefully this will kind of encourage people to be sensible. And this is again the positive way to be sensible for the ocean literacy, to know about the Baltic Sea, about whales, because they are under threat elsewhere, and that we certainly know.
Mm-hmm. And I guess maybe we can open the floor to both of the psychologists. Is how do we kind of square those contradictions and that mental gymnastics that we do as humans, where we, like you were saying earlier, doing day-to-day actions that are actually probably causing some of the systemic problems that Timmy died of, with our desire to save the animal, and sort of in the same way go against when we were saving Timmy, or I wasn't personally involved, but when Timmy was being saved, how were the people who were desperate to save him squaring that with expert advice saying this is going to be like equivalent to torture? What kind of thing goes on in our brains as humans to make those two things kind of be able to exist at the same time?
It's kind of a moral dilemma that they're in, right? Because they have this sense of moral obligation to this individual whale that's in front of them that's in need, and they, if if you are concerned about whales, as whether at the individual level or at the population level, you have one in front of you that's in need and is eliciting this concern that you have. It's hard to then maybe do the more cold utilitarian kind of calculation about thinking about, well, is this a good use of our funds? How could our resources be better used when you have that sort of victim in front of you in need, you know, if I most of my reading around this comes from articles in the Guardian, so it's what they're kind of what I've read about, that there was sort of primarily two wealthy German individuals who raised those funds. That, you know, maybe some of the onus was on them to think about, that's a large amount of funds that that they were contributing. Might, you know, they put a pause on their moral emotions and think more kind of rationally about the usage of those funds, if they really do care about whales. And, you know, Timmy is now becoming the mascot for whales more broadly. How, you know, reframe it. What could I, you know, if I'm not going to use it for the rescue effort, then I should earmark it for how can I promote, you know, something that's going to be helpful for a larger number of whales, dealing with the net entanglement, you know, collisions with vessels, other kinds of issues that are more systemic that whales are facing. In a way, yeah, you have to kind of turn off those emotions to be able to do the utilitarian, maybe the more effective. This is one of the, you know, the principles of effective altruism, is to think in terms of scale, and not just kind of go with your gut or your heart in terms of where you're going to invest those resources, and to think more logically. System 2, kind of cold, rational decision. But in the end, it's not less compassionate, because you're still helping individuals, and in fact, you could be helping more individuals by doing the more kind of cold utilitarian thing. That's one way of kind of framing it. But I think in the moment when there's an emergency, a kind of urgent matter, system 1 is oftentimes sorry, I'm using kind of psychology speak here, but, you know, kind of drawing on the emotion, and all the, I think what was happening in social media, the sharing of images and all of that was you know, that was really kind of galvanizing, and you know, eliciting a more emotional way of dealing with the problem than taking a step back and thinking more in terms of scale and scope, and and there's a whole horrible tragic outcome too, because in the end it was all for naught. But yeah, sorry, I'll let Matt respond to that question as well.
Yeah, thanks. If the question's about, you know, how do we live with those moral dilemmas, I suppose my response would be humans are really perfectly capable of living with contradictory thoughts and motivations. We're quite good at it, good in inverted commas, and what we tend to do is try and resolve them, sure, but we don't resolve them in rational ways necessarily. And that's what Freud was all about in many ways. So, you know, part of the way of resolving those dilemmas is by naming an individual, throwing everything into it, getting really cross when it doesn't happen, or blaming the wrong targets, blaming the people who tried to save them, or blaming others. And all that work is a defense mechanism in one sense, in that it means we don't have to think about our culpability or the more complex dynamics that are going on in the oceans, and the existential crisis around the ecological decline and so on. So in that sense, you know, straightforward response to your question is, you know, we're good at that. We can live with it. I mean, actually, we're quite irrational in terms of how we respond. And you could argue that the responses reflect that irrationality sometimes.
I don't know if this is there a reason for that, evolutionary wise, why our brains are able to live with those contradictions so easily?
I would like to chime in and say, well, you could say it's irrational on one level, but in terms of like an evolutionary story, you know, this is our brains evolved in a environment where, yeah, we were mainly dealing with individuals in front of us in our community who we didn't evolve to be concerned about individuals living far, you know, not immediately in our kind of community and other, parts of the world. And yeah, someone in front of you, rather than learning about someone in need through some media where they're not, you know, you don't have that direct relationship with them.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, this is yeah. So our brains are designed for dealing with, in terms of how we relate to certainly in terms of helping and interceding on behalf of victims, to really get those moral emotions going. It's we respond to imagery, our attention's drawn to faces, or it can be through the use of imagination as well, but still the story will be focused on an individual. As soon as you begin to, and there's plenty of research on this in psychology, as soon as you begin to add numbers of individuals, you can't focus your attention in the same way, and your emotions don't respond in the same way. Even when you add one more life to the matter, that's two individuals you have to be concerned about. And certainly large numbers, they show that this is called the psychic numbing effect, that in fact you can present a story, individuals learning about a famine happening somewhere in Africa and 3 million people are suffering, or you can show them an image of one of a child from a village where they are suffering, and that's it, and people are more likely to donate if they just can focus on the one individual in front of them, have an image of them, their face, they can see that they're in need. That's much more likely to lead to people taking action than if you give them the scale of it. And even if you combine those two, they show in studies, if you combine the two, adding the stats in actually lowers people's. So it's actually a numbing that you can have a representative individual to focus on, that you add the numbers and people begin to care less. And there's several, to explain why part of it is about this, that numbers don't activate our emotions, but also you could say then the problem becomes so complex in people's minds. It's like, well, what can I do? Is it my efforts are really gonna help, and so on. So there's a pragmatic side to it as well.
We've just got a question here from Aisling, which is, maybe I'll direct to you, Finn. Given that the rescue was botched, who bears responsibility? The agencies involved, the media circus around it, or the public vote for a happy ending to Timmy's story? What are your initial thoughts on that question?
Well, in the end, it's kind of doesn't help the whale in any case who is kind of responsible. And I mean, it's I probably wouldn't kind of pinpoint any one involved, because it was kind of an exception of leaving the whale on the beach. So this is kind of probably it would start from there, but in the end, what I said, it's kind of doesn't help the whale anyway. So it's kind of, I was again not about the responsibility, but also understanding, and what Jared just said about helping, and I have the feeling that here is really a misunderstanding, that also talking about emergency, just because a whale pops up on the beach is kind of, we have this signal, oh, this is an emergency, we must keep the whale somewhere in deeper water regardless, because we can't judge from the outside if it's in what kind of condition, and maybe there was a cause. And I mean, we talked about that it was kind of entangled in nets, and partly it was removed, probably as we don't know yet if it kind of amounts of nets it was swallowed maybe, and was suffering also from hunger and etc. So from this point of view, I would kind of really not so much interested in who is responsible in kind of taking the action, but the information we lose by not kind of staying on the scientific way to understand what happened and how we can kind of lower the threats to the next humpback whale that is coming to the Baltic Sea. What are the measures that we need to take? Is it really the nets that are floating outside or sticking somewhere, not managed again? So kind of these kind of known ghost nets, are they kind of the problem? And should we focus on this? So it's not the focus on the responsibility. It's about how to save the next whales that come to the Baltic Sea, and that they are kind of surviving this excursion to the Baltic Sea, because it's kind of a frequent visit of these whales. I mean, they can navigate in these shallow waters, especially this species. So again, we shouldn't be kind of distracted to kind of pinpoint of, we should make kind of a cut and say lessons learned. And also in terms of donations, why are we donating here? And maybe also for the next kind of politicians to say, okay, here's a clear line. We should stick to the expert's mind. Mm-hmm. And we define first who are the experts, because in the end, we also, as an NGO, we kind of changed our wordings, because since Corona, we are all experts, out of a sudden. And then first we should, and I mean, this was crystal clear, and it was a good move by the ministry to ask scientific experts they relied on in the past. Why would you leave any advice that is given in this kind of very good founded paper? And then all of a sudden other experts, whatever experts they are, came and say, well, there's a glimpse of, hope. Should we do action? And then this works as a valve that the emotions were kind of, letting loose and saying, of course we need to. And I think this was kind of the wrong signal at this kind of very late stage of the condition of the whale that,
yeah,
it was kind of,
I guess that I've just seen.
It was not a good move.
No, I've just seen Janice's question, which is how concerned are the panel that public emotion overrode scientific judgment? And I thought that'd be a good one to compound on to kind of what you were saying there. If you have anything more to add to that, Finn or Jared and Matthew.
Would you like to go first, Matt, or Finn?
Yeah, I mean, how concerned am I? I guess I'm concerned, because of what I said about the way that the emotions can work and can obscure. In terms of overriding scientific judgment, I mean, I agree that that's what should take the kind of foreground here. But I suppose I add something else in there, in that it's not, the way forward isn't only to cede authoritative scientific judgment, because that's not working already. I mean, the science is already clear. So we need something more than that, even in a structure response beyond psychology, I think. But for me, in terms of what I've written about the past, it does actually connect these two, in that it's also about potentially rights of nature and extending what we think of as personhood, not to an individual whale, but we all know of examples of the Wanganui River in Atoria, New Zealand, for example, now has legal personhood, which is a particular kind of personhood, has a guardian obligated to speak for it, institutional arrangements, enforceable rights, whether they're enforced or not. This didn't come from naming a river and that going viral in the same way as, I've forgotten his name now, Timmy did. It came from generations, actually, of his insistence, often from indigenous populations, that the river is not a resource, but a relative, however alien that is to non-indigenous communities, and eventually finding political and legal forms, as well as scientific authority, adequate to that insistence, I suppose. And that takes time. It involves grief as well, actually, in terms of what's already happened. But it's held and directed into kind of the political will. And I think that's really important, alongside this kind of scientific authority, that those legal possibilities and the will for it.
Mm-hmm. I think, my reaction was... Sorry.
No, well, I was just going to add that the whale and its biology and ecology needs to be understood by the public. That, the river is kind of also we have kind of a good common sense of why a river and what is kind of the ecosystem around it, and that it is a relative, and I can feel a river. But do we really understand the whale? I mean, these whales are kind of traveling, thousands of kilometers, and they don't need to eat for months, and so they're kind of just like humans. I mean, they are organisms. They can, suffer a lot before we are dying. And then to understand this, it's kind of also for the next time making it much more easy for the politicians to say, well, now we understand the organism's whale and that it's not dying the next minute because it's such a huge body, a huge organism, and it's kind of takes a time to rest. And then, because this understanding, and this is kind of what we are working on a lot about the sensibility, about, what is it about nature that we really get a sense of nature back again, because it's kind of not virtual. You can actually get out to the beach and touch it. You can't swish and swipe. It's existing. And this was probably also, one of the elements why it was so fantastic, to have something happening. So I was just going to add this kind of understanding of what whales are, their organisms, is probably fading out of the memories of the society, to feel what these huge, massive, magnificent animals, but to understand their biology. I mean, this should be also kind of in our common sense. Yeah. But I much like the idea to have this kind of individual right to nature.
I was just going to quickly add for I guess thinking about the kind of psychology of intervention and so this question of kind of pitting emotion and scientific judgment against whether I kind of push back on that. I wouldn't I'd say that's probably a false economy. We do, being someone who studies who's interested in how our empathy towards animals happens, we need emotion. People need to care about animals. We don't care enough about animals in the world. So I wouldn't say emotion's the kind of villain here that kind of overrode the scientific judgment. You need both things, because you first have to care about an animal species and individuals, populations, but then you also need this kind of understanding of what would be the best, of what would be the best response. But if you don't care about the animals at all, you're not gonna get involved. I'm looking at other interactions and relationships we have with animals in various domains in society. This is something I'm interested in. Why don't more people care about the animals that we eat, and why is that? Are we so accepting of those kinds of relationships? Why don't people care more? You do need to first get people to have an emotional response, because that's the way we work. That's the way we operate. That's how our moral system operates. We need to activate those emotions, but to do right by animals at scale, then we also need to heed. We need to the scientific judgment informing what would be the best way to help whales, and not just focus on one individual. So especially when there's limited resources, and we know most most funding goes towards helping humans. That little bit that goes to animals goes mainly to helping the companion animals, cats and dogs. Very little that goes to wildlife, wild animals, animals that are farmed. So these are, I would just say it's not either or. We need people being caring and having those emotions elicited, but then also to have the kind of sober judgment about, well, is this a good way to help? Maybe not. It's just too narrow to approach it this way. So yeah, that would be my kind of response to that.
Yeah, that was actually going to be one of my questions, is about David Attenborough's documentaries are obviously so brilliant at telling the sort of human aspects of the animals and making you care, but without kind of making them too human in a way.
Yeah.
And that narrative.
Seeing them in all their individuality. Yeah.
And I'm very aware of time, so just one final question, I think. From Timmy the whale, obviously the outcome is not what anyone would have wanted, but what it kind of feeds into the things we just touched on. What can we learn from how humans have interacted with this rescue attempt to help us better inform conservation and attracting funding in the future and helping humans engage? Should we start with you, Finn?
Well, I can probably, it's this kind of a question about lessons learned. And I know that the German media, it's still not over yet, because we still have a lot of interview requests about, learning more about the Baltic Sea health status. And there are so many actions that are evolving from this. So here, I really hope that this momentum keeps alive, and that the emotion is kind of directed not only on animals, but also the Baltic Sea in itself. And next time I hope that there is an understanding of what is happening, and until then we can kind of lower the threats, especially the nets that are kind of abandoned. And we chase them to get them out of the waters.
And how about you, Jared?
I guess I'm just reflecting on the fact that these conversations are happening now, and hopefully these conversations will be happening more broadly. Reflection on this whole process of how this kind of went awry, and what is the kind of a proper response to these these situations, because they recur, right? Where we end up in these back in these situations where we're making decisions where we're not making the best decision in terms of how to use a finite, limited resource and funds that we have to help a population of individuals. So it's unfortunate that this happened, but maybe there'll be more kind of reflection on this and the fact that this was a poor decision, and how to approach it better in the future, understanding the psychology of it. The more people can kind of learn, in fact, look, you're operating from a purely kind of emotional response here. Let's pause and consider, maybe from a more utilitarian point of view, a better way to respond to this situation. That's kind of from the public point of view. That would be my kind of hope, that public can kind of learn that, and then you don't get this bandwagoning effect. People are aware of this is not the best way to respond. There are so learning the principles of effective altruism can help the public understand what are better ways of using our money to help animals. So that's one reflection. And I just want to thank there's a number of questions here from the audience that maybe we won't be able to get to, but there's some interesting ones there. And just to thank the audience for those. Can we respond to those after the session is over?
Is it Jeremy's question you're up? What's more successful in driving conservation funding, publicizing?
The first one from Alan about the name, that was an interesting one, and I would have things to say about that, and how we anthropomorphize animals, and not just animals, machines. Now with AI and robots, we do this as well, giving names to machines, and that makes them more relatable. But it's certainly, it'll change the way we engage with animals, and we do this, of course, with companion animals, and there's a lot to be said about that. There's a psychology of anthropomorphism that I would direct that individual to read up on. They might find some interesting. I think someone did share at least one paper there on that. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, we'll have to have you back on to talk a bit more about that.
Oh, sure. Yeah, anytime.
And Matthew, coming to you.
I haven't got much to add really to it in terms of next steps. I'd agree with both. I think generally for the kind of conservation movement interested in these things, personally, I see the rights of nature as a strong way forward, not the only way. It involves other things. It involves working with scientists and working with community groups as well. But it does seem to be a way of kind of capturing personhood and also generating potentially at least genuine political shifts that are a bit more progressive and kind of challenge some of the individualization and the kind of short-term conservation efforts that maybe Timmy the whale represents. So yeah, I kind of reiterate that as a point of optimism, I suppose.
Yeah, well, that's a nice note to end on. And that brings this week's panel to an end. So thank you very much for your time and for your insightful answers. And if you enjoyed watching this week's Roundtable, make sure to come back to next week's one, where we'll be discussing another big news story from the Oceanographic newsroom. Also, be sure to check out our podcast, our online features, our magazine, and much, much more. So thanks so much for watching. Thanks for joining me, and tune in next week for the next discussion. Thanks so much, guys.
Thanks, Eva. Take care, everyone.
Bye. Cheers.